The Long Road by Wolfland. A cold rush swept over Stephen as he watched Skarmory struggle to stand, the shadowy coating from the arena floor clinging to its feathers in black, sticky patches. Frantic, Skarmory screeched and tugged against the muck as Sableye approached, still grinning with cold, expressionless eyes. It sauntered to a stop right in front of Skarmory's beak and raised a clawed hand, palm out. Dark energy began to swirl, and Skarmory let out a weak caw as it was helpless to avoid the point-blank attack. And yet, Stephen found himself unable to do anything but watch. A voice at the back of his mind screamed for him to recall Skarmory to its ball, but his limbs wouldn't obey. The darkness that flooded the battlefield slowly poured into the trainer's box, and although he couldn't tear his gaze from where Skarmory was trapped, he could feel the icy grip of the shadows roll over his feet, filling his veins with dread. The explosion of Sableye's Dark Pulse reverberated through the chamber, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Stephen's body that ripped through the paralyzing fear. Skarmory! He found his voice with a shout of dismay. Skarmory lay at the center of a small crater, unconscious. Black shadows slowly poured over the lip, pooling around its still form. Sableye stood at the rim, its eerie expression unchanged. Recalling Skarmory back before the black muck swallowed it whole, Stephen's pulse pounded in his ears as he selected his next Pokeball with a quaking hand. He wasn't sure which unnerved him more, the fact that Bennett had switched seamlessly with Sableye without direction from their trainer, or the fact that he just lost 2 Pokemon without laying a finger on either of the elites. Even though he was still ahead in the match, he couldn't stop the hint of desperation that seeped into his voice. Metagross, I need your help! Already on high alert as it landed on the battlefield, Metagross let loose a pulse of psychic energy that dispelled the pool of shadows from beneath its feet in a rush of air. The spiky tufts at the side of Sableye's head fluttered at the display of power, but still it simply stared, eyes vacant. The familiar presence of his starter sent a reassuring wave over Stephen, and suddenly, it no longer felt like the shadowy walls were closing in around them. Bolstered by Metagross's confident rumble, Stephen took to the offensive. Meteor Mash! In a push that left cracks in the arena floor, Metagross shot towards Sableye with a roar. Its claw drove straight through the motionless Pokemon, but instead of sending it tumbling, it was instantly obliterated in a cloud of tattered shadows. Metagross's eyes went wide as the remnants of its opponent fluttered to the ground, and Stephen too frowned with worry. Substitute! Both trainer and Pokemon jumped at the first words Phoebe had spoken since her collapse. She was still slumped over on her knees, limp and lifeless, but Stephen was sure she had said something. But he no longer had time to worry about the elite's condition, as up from the shadowy battlefield sprung no less than 20 identical Sableye copies. They climbed up and out from the pool of darkness, and dragged themselves in a circle around Metagross, whose red eyes darted nervously from one target to the next. Stephen clenched his jaw at the rising lilt in its rumbling question. Metagross was strong, but the last time they had fought a horde of ghost types, things had not ended well. But if what Phoebe had uttered was true, then there was only one real target in the sea of clones. Take them out one by one! Find the real Sableye! The plan had sounded good in his head, but as Metagross threw itself at the ring of substitutes, Stephen realized it would not be so simple, for they all moved just like an actual Sableye, and as his partner would bear down on one target, another clone would twitch to life and fire a Dark Pulse that would catch Metagross unaware. As the third sneak attack slammed into Metagross's flank, it sunk to the ground with a groan of pain. The familiar tightness snaked back around Stephen's chest, and in a panic, He began patting his pockets, searching for something. "Metagross, retreat now!" His partner managed to rise back to its feet and lurch through the ring of substitutes back towards where he stood, finally having retrieved Glacia's full restore from his jacket pocket. Keeping a wary eye on the battlefield, Steven beckoned Metagross close and administered the healing item. It rattled a sigh as its fatigue melted away, and Steven allowed himself a shaky breath of relief as well. "Okay." But just as the words left his lips, Metagross let loose a cry of pain. Sableye had used the shadows to slide across the battlefield undetected in a shadow sneak, and dragged its claws across Metagross's rear leg. But the ghost type underestimated Metagross's reaction time, and before it could slip back into the shadows again, Metagross wheeled around with another leg and batted Sableye across the battlefield like a ragdoll. Sableye hit the ground with a screech, but instead of bouncing, it melted into the puddle of shadows that coated the arena, and so too did the substitutes, leaving the battlefield quiet and empty. As Metagross slowly turned to face the center of the arena, Steven saw the lingering effects of Sableye's attack. 3 claw marks were gouged deep in Metagross's armor, still sizzling with dark energy. He grimaced. Even with its strong defenses, its weakness to ghost-type moves meant it couldn't trade too many blows with their opponents. But instead of Sableye, it was Banette that reappeared from the shadows, air alight with a will-o-wisp. But Metagross was ready. A pulse of its psychic power surged forth, extinguishing the flames as it rushed forward. For the first time, Steven saw Banette's ever-present smile falter, just before Metagross's fist slammed into its face. The ghost type bounced and skipped across the arena floor before several shadow tendrils lifted up from the floor to catch it before it skidded any further. Gingerly picking its way back to its feet, Banette wore a scowl as it held its cheek in its hands, displeased with its treatment as Metagross's punching bag. "Keep at it, Metagross!" But as Metagross bore down a second time, Banette had no interest in taking that attack again. Except that, as it began to slip back into the shadows, Metagross changed its course. Its fist arced downward into the arena floor, sending chunks of earth airborne, effectively separating the shadows where Banette was intending to hide from the rest of the pool. Trapped, Banette made a desperate bid to dive back to the arena floor, but Metagross was waiting. With a gleam in its red eyes, Metagross's other forelegs swept through the air and caught Banette in the midsection. Banette hung motionlessly for a second, its body folded neatly in half around Metagross's leg, before it gave a startled wheeze and rocketed away and into the sidewall of the chamber. Chunks of rubble rained to the ground around where Banette had fallen, and Steven was barely able to peer through the darkness and spot the ghost quivering as it tried to rise. He frowned. "Almost there, Metagross. Just a bit more." His voice trailed off, as for the first time since the beginning of the round, a bright light pierced through the gloom of the shadowy battlefield and concentrated beneath Metagross's feet. Both trainer and Pokémon glanced down at the unusual sight, but before Steven could question the origin of the mysterious light, Metagross froze in place with a violent shudder and let loose a cry the likes of which he had never heard before. Equal parts animalistic howl and rising screech, Metagross writhed as the white light pulsed beneath it, somehow looking almost like it was alive, breathing, and slowly it saturated until it glowed blood red. "Metagross, look out!" The words died in Steven's throat with a strangled noise as his hands flew to clutch at his shirt. A searing pain shot through his chest. It felt as if someone had jabbed a knife between his ribs, but when he looked down, there was no wound. Metagross howled again, and Steven found himself trying to stifle another gasp as the pain rose once more, and he doubled over with a cough. When he withdrew his hand from his mouth, he was greeted with the sight of bright red droplets. He blinked, shocked, but in an instant the blood was gone, his palm clean of the sticky liquid. What? Squinting through the pain that had not disappeared, the light that engulfed his partner had vanished, leaving it even harder to spot Metagross through the heavy haze of shadows. What? He choked on another short breath at the sharp discomfort. What is happening? His answer came in the form of a rising giggle from where Banette had floated back to the battlefield. Her pain split had successfully sapped Metagross's restored energy and given it to her, saving her from succumbing to its last attack. Now back on her feet, Banette fixed the staggered Metagross with a wild-eyed stare, faint chuckle still echoing around the chamber. Dark energy radiated outward from her petite form and seeped across the broken arena floor to puddle around the steel-type's feet. "Metagross, get out of there!" Steven grated out, the stabbing in his ribs now dulled by an ache at the back of his head. Somehow, it felt as if Banette was pulsing with malice, and the very heartbeat of her hatred was pounding inside of his skull. But there was no time to worry about himself, as Metagross's sluggishness hadn't worn off, and made it an easy target for Banette's tendrils to lash around its hide, pinning it in place. Unblinking neon eyes strayed from where his partner was trapped, and pierced Steven with their gaze, sending a rush of ice through his veins. Without looking back at the trapped Pokémon, slowly, Banette raised one hand, palm open, before clenching her claws tight. At the motion, Hex's tendrils pulled taut with a surge of ghostly energy, and Metagross roared in agony as Steven watched, the overpowering menace from Banette's stare freezing him in place. Spurred into action from the new wave of pain, Metagross surged to life, thrashing beneath Hex's grip. But as one tendril tore, two more snaked from the shadows to replace it. Another pulse of energy rushed forth, and Metagross buckled under the pain. Its underbelly hit the ground with a mighty thud, kicking up dust. But Banette must have sensed that even though Metagross was down, it wasn't out. And just as the Steel-type tried to surge back to its feet with a push of its psychic powers, the Ghost Pokémon dove forward with a Shadow Claw at the ready, and raked its attack directly across Metagross's face. Red eyes lost their blue psychic glow as they squeezed shut from Banette's assault, but the Ghost-type would not let up. Slash after slash lashed out, until the four mighty legs tugging against Hex's bonds fell slack. Banette paused mid-strike and smiled, lowering her claw. Metagross had succumbed, and Steven's heart skipped a beat. He missed the way Banette's shoulders slumped with exhaustion as she grinned. He ignored the numbness that seeped into his limbs. He didn't care about how he was down to his final two Pokémon. His mind went blank as he stared at the form of his fallen partner, his friend. Not a rumble or a huff or a hum, just cold, dead silence that was more of a punch in the gut than any of Phoebe's ghostly tricks.